twins Ronnie and Reggie Kray grew up to become Britain's most notorious gangster duo. Much of this was due to the place they were born and the stories of their brutal ways of committing crimes. In the 1960s, the British media often portrayed the East End of London as a glamorous area that was always leading the trends. From the late 19th century onwards, the process of industrialization and rapid growth in this area created a huge working class living in squalid conditions, poverty and social evils such as robbery, rape, and even murder. Gangs filled the streets. At night, the streets were often dark and dirty, mainly brothels. The famous American writer Jack London described this place as London's abandoned land, and George Gissing, famous for his novel New Grub Street, commented that this was the city of the dead. In the late 19th century, the capital of London under the rule of Queen Victoria developed extremely prosperously, becoming a magnet attracting immigrants from all over the world. Most of them were Irish, Jews from Eastern Europe, and Russians. They lived crowded in dirty and slums in the East End, in contrast to the West End where the rich lived. The East End concentrated the most difficult and polluted industries of the city, such as leather tanning, distilling, metal foundries, glass furnaces, slaughterhouses, with dilapidated houses, surrounded by sewers and waste flowing from slaughterhouses. Whitechapel was like a stain on the magnificent face of London. Hard life was always fertile ground for violence, robbery, prostitution, and other social evils to develop. London police estimated in October 1988 that there were 62 brothels with 1,200 first-class prostitutes operating in Whitechapel. The best way for them to forget their hard lives was with bottles of gin that cost a few pence. The East End is also known as the home of the world's first notorious serial killer, the man known as Jack the Ripper in the squalid suburb of Whitechapel. It was also home to the powerful twins of the British underworld, the Kray brothers. Charlie and Violet Kray and their son Charlie Jr. lived in Stena Street, Hoxton, now known as Shoreditch, with its squalid terraced houses. At 8 a.m. on Tuesday, October 24, 1933, Violet gave birth to twin boys and named them Ronnie and Reggie. Reggie was born 10 minutes before Ronnie. The Krays were a traditional East End family, self-sufficient and concerned only with their own family. As children, they were both very ill and contracted diphtheria. Ronnie almost died. In 1939, when the Second World War began, the family moved to the East End about a mile down the road and lived in Bethnal Green, 178 Valence Road. It was a small house with no bathroom and the toilet was in the backyard. At the time, Valence was part of a Jewish ghetto with gambling dens, pubs, and dozens of brothels lining the dilapidated landscape. It was also home to a large population of heavy drinkers and boxing fanatics. It was notorious for its slums and high crime and unemployment rates. The district was one of the poorest in the East End and could be considered a hotbed of crime. It was also where Jack the Ripper murdered one of his victims in Hanbury Street. The family had a history of crime, too. Their grandfather, nicknamed Mad Jimmy Kray, was a street vendor on Petticoat Street, a godfather of alcohol and a skilled barman. Growing up, the twins became just as devious as each other. With their father's dark eyes and a maniacal streak, Ronnie was slower and more autistic than his brother after contracting diphtheria and measles. Their father taught them boxing and they both did very well. The proof is that they reached the finals of the London Schools Boxing Championship 3 times. Once they even knocked each other out for the championship. Ronnie and Reggie were always together. Although they fought often, they did not let anyone come between them. Like other twins, they were indifferent to the other tough kids in the neighborhood. Growing up during the tumultuous World War II, when their father was busy hiding from the army, they were single-handedly cared for by their mother Violet and grandmother, both hard-working housewives. Their mother's blind love, accepting everything her children did, made them lose the ability to distinguish right from wrong. From a young age, they often caused trouble and could beat others at any time. Like the tradition of resolving conflicts and disputes of gangs, disagreements here were also extinguished with fists, knives, and many other weapons. The twins became the most violent gangster duo in the area. During this time, Ronnie and Reggie began to achieve some success in their professional boxing careers. Ronnie won 4 out of 6 fights, and Reggie won all 6 of them. On March 2nd, 1952, the Kray brothers were drafted into the army. Ronnie and Reggie Kray were forced to serve 2 years in military prison for desertion. A year after being dismissed from the army, the twins embarked on a risky new business. With money borrowed from their brother Charlie, the twins rented the old Regal Cinema on Eric Street, on the edge of Mile End Road in Bethnal Green, and turned it into a billiards room with 14 tables ready for customers. The billiards room, open day and night, quickly became a meeting place for a diverse group of people. Men who had just been released from prison, old friends of the twins from their service, some of the bad guys from society, Mile End gangsters, all gathered here in search of something new and exciting. Ronnie began to cultivate the image he had always cherished. He began to dress like a gangster, clothes that emphasized his strong chest and broad shoulders, plus he wore large rings and large bracelets. He also reserved for himself a throne, a large chair opposite the entrance, which helped him to observe people coming and going. Although not of muscular or tall build, the Kray twins were excellent boxers. In the fights and brawls that followed, the Kray brothers never lost with their strong shoulders and arms, and their punches that were accurate to the millimeter. Visitors to the Regal could fight right away with the owner. One night, Ronnie drank up to 55 beers but was still surprisingly sober the next day. Reggie was known as the Divine Puncher. He spent hours practicing punching the punching bag. Reggie once offered a stranger a cigarette with his right hand, then used his left hand to hook the man's jaw when he opened his mouth to receive the cigarette. The Kray brothers quickly realized the importance of leadership and discipline in work. Gathering information from close associates was also quite important. The brothers selected a group of young men who swore to live and die with them to carry out their big plans. Ronnie was very fond of weapons and had a collection of bayonets and Gurkha knives. They were on public display at 178 Valence. Reggie was more practical than his younger brother Ronnie. Reggie was very concerned about the safety of the Regal and was busy building relationships with the police and local authorities. At that time, the Kray brothers were still not famous in the East End underworld. Most of the local gangsters ignored them, until one day, the Three Dockers, the notorious gang that controlled this area, sent Ronnie and Reggie a challenge. On Sunday morning, the Kray brothers showed up as scheduled. They calmly walked into a small pub on Mile End Road. There were only 3 large, calm men drinking in the pub. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. The real fight began. A few hours passed. There was a crash inside, blood and broken glass all over the bar. 2 of the 3 dockers were dragged out unconscious. Ronnie was stopped by his men before he could kill the other. The Kray brothers were starting to become a concern for other gangs. Aggressive and violent as they were, Ronnie led a rather simple life. He lived in a family flat in Valence Road. Apart from running a pool hall and getting into fights, Ronnie had no other hobbies. He couldn't drive, couldn't steal, and couldn't understand how to bet or gamble. He also had no desire for a life of luxury. He had no interest in women. Ronnie's only weakness was young men. He was always gentle with young men. However, Ronnie was especially cautious about gay rumors. He rarely took a guy out of town. What he really wanted was fame and respect. Now that he had achieved that, he worked even harder to protect it. Ronnie practiced yoga and ate raw eggs every day to stay healthy. He also became increasingly obsessed with the police. Ronnie suspected that his phone calls were being tapped. Every night, he slept with a loaded gun in a room that was always lit. In 1956, the Kray brothers were only 22 years old but already notorious in the underworld. They began to protect other gangs and illegal activities such as gambling and betting. This activity brought in a lot of cash for the Kray gang. Both wanted to be big bosses in the criminal world, not just hired hands in this dark settlement. London, the largest and most luxurious city in England, was the Kray brothers' target to fulfill their ambition. London has always been a magnet for people looking for quick, easy money. Many of the world's most notorious gangs have emerged from the city, including the Sabinis, Elephant and Castle Mob. The Kray brothers' pool hall has grown into a real business, not just a meeting place for gangsters. Ronnie spent much of his time thinking about what he called the politics of crime, the need for the most capable loyalists to form the foundation of the gang before moving into London. One night, the twins and their men drove to Hillcomer after a rumor that a gang was after them. Ronnie stormed into the pub. After a brief scuffle with a few men in the pub, he pulled out his Muser and fired 3 shots. He didn't shoot anyone, and no one dared to stop him as he walked out of the pub and back to his van parked outside. He left the pub with the kind of glory any gangster would want. Ronnie declared coldly, "It's time. We're not playing kids anymore." The Kray twins stopped getting into random fights. From then on, everything in the gang was organized. Everything was done with a purpose. Reggie bought a fancy car from America to show off the gang's growing power. Ronnie openly admitted that he was gay. By the end of 1956, the Kray brothers controlled a large area from East Bethnal Green to Mile End and Stepney. The Kray brothers had become dangerous bosses. In the winter of 1956, Ronnie took up arms for the first time, seriously wounding a customer at a car dealership in Bethnal Green, which was under the protection of the Kray brothers. The man later informed the police and asked to prosecute Ronnie for wounding. But the police received a photograph of Ronnie taken elsewhere at the time of the shooting. They could not charge Ronnie. The Kray brothers relied on their similar appearance to fool the police in this case. By mid-1956, the Kray brothers had established a strong foothold in London's West End. A friend of the brothers, Billy Jones, had a large club in Cambridge Circus, Soho, under their protection. Although it was a legitimate club, it was a place that attracted gangsters. The Kray brothers also frequented it and got into big trouble. The Kray brothers became acquainted with a guy named Ramsey. The 3 of them, in a few moments of impulsiveness, lost control of their actions and caused scandals that forced the police to intervene. Ronnie was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison on November 5, 1956 at Wandsworth Prison. Outside, Reggie was still doing well on his own. A month after Ronnie went to prison, the billiards business was moved to another location, expanding into the largest club in the East End. Reggie also opened a center for boxing enthusiasts. Henry Cooper, a famous British boxer, was present at the opening ceremony. The center quickly developed and attracted many famous people in many different fields. Reggie turned to legal business but did not give up the gang's underworld activities. Reggie directed everything more carefully and somewhat cunningly. Together with his brother, Reggie opened a casino and horse racing betting right in the area near the police car park on Bow Street. In the East End, London, any Kray gang members who were sentenced to prison were taken care of very carefully, and their family members. A junior who was serving his sentence at Wandsworth Prison praised the Kray brothers. Therefore, when it was Ronnie's turn to go to prison, he did not have much difficulty. During his short time in prison, Ronnie was able to manipulate a large portion of the inmates and even the administrators by providing them with the necessities of food and medicine. But the period that followed was truly tragic for Ronnie. Ronnie became addicted to cigarettes and began to change completely, withdrawing. He was diagnosed with a mental disorder caused by his imprisonment, which would not be too difficult to treat. At Christmas 1957, Ronnie received the news that his Aunt Rose had died after a long illness with leukemia. This news was a real shock to Ronnie because he loved this woman very much. On the morning of December 28th, Mrs. Violet Kray received a telegram from the warden of Wandsworth Prison with the content: "Doctors have concluded that your son, Ronnie Kray, is mentally ill." On February 20th, 1958, Ronnie left the prison in an ambulance. Ronnie was transferred to Victoria Asylum. The doctor concluded that Ronnie's illness could not be cured. Suffolk is a county in the southeast of England with agriculture as the main economic sector. The market in the town of Sudbury is located 40 miles northeast of London. In the middle of Borley Rectory, where the haunted house used to be, was a farm owned by a friend of Reggie's. 2 weeks before Ronnie was released from hospital, Reggie had pulled a caravan over and hidden it in the woods on the farm. A week after the escape, Reggie took his brother to his new hideout. Teddy, a big shot, was assigned to look after Ronnie, and they needed to be on the run for at least 6 weeks. By law, any prisoner who escaped for more than 6 weeks would be ordered to be rearrested. All Ronnie had to do was stay out of trouble and turn himself in on time. He could then complete his sentence and be released within a year. However, Ronnie, by nature, was not content to live in the countryside and insisted on returning to the East End. He would often go to the Double R and drink and party with friends so that he could disguise himself and stroll down the streets of Whitechapel, deliberately walking past the police. Sometimes he would dress up in Reggie's clothes and go drinking at the bar his brother frequented. But he became increasingly depressed and paranoid about people and suggested killing his troublesome neighbor to the owner of the farm where he was hiding. The owner, concerned about Ronnie's unstable state and homicidal tendencies, arranged for him to see a psychiatrist. After the consultation, the psychiatrist told the owner, "I don't know who your friend is, but he shows signs of severe schizophrenia. Get him to a hospital before something bad happens." Then one day, the police came to check the farm to find a criminal more famous than Ronnie. He was Alfred Hines, who had an IQ of 150 and was always running away from prison. The farm owner successfully convinced the police that Hines was not there, but Ronnie, who had been hiding from the police for weeks, became terrified of them and decided he would escape the farm and kill anyone who tried to stop him. Reggie arrived and took his brother to his flat in Bayswater, London, and called a doctor to treat Ronnie. He was so hysterical that he had to drink 2 bottles of gin a day and take tranquilizers to calm himself. On one occasion, Ronnie tried to kill himself. A meeting of the Kray family was called, and it was agreed that the brothers should be separated. The police were called at 2 a.m. the next morning. As they led him away, he mumbled and did not look back at his family. After a short time, he was diagnosed with a mental illness and released in the spring of 1959. Reggie and Charlie took him home. After treatment in hospital, Ronnie seemed to return to normal. However, he became a different person, more moody. He became more depressed, suspicious of everyone, and extremely fearful. Ronnie became cautious, suspicious of everyone around him, and became more intimidating. His appearance changed a lot. The Kray brothers no longer looked so much alike that it was impossible to tell them apart. He became a real monster. Ronnie went into business, protecting the casino his brother owned. A meeting with some Italians about dividing the shares broke down after Ronnie became angry, cursing and insulting them. Frustrated and disappointed, Reggie talked to a friend and asked, "What am I going to do with Ron? He's ruining everything. I know I have to get rid of Ronnie, but how can I do that? He's my brother and he's crazy." The differences in the way the brothers ran their business became more apparent as Reggie focused on business and Ronnie fumbled around, mostly just causing trouble. A few months after his return, Ronnie got into a bar fight with the Watney Street gang. The next day, the newspapers called it the worst brawl in the East End. Ronnie had always wanted to create a home for all the gangs in London under his command. The more trouble he caused, the more quickly Reggie's foundation collapsed. Their first headquarters, the pool hall, was closed by the local authorities. The brothers' main income came from the Double R and the casino on Wellington Way. In the summer of 1959, Daniel Shea, a wealthy Londoner who had been convicted of at least 13 counts of fraud, met Ronnie and bragged about his connection to the Krays. Ronnie had borrowed money from Shea a few times and never paid it back. Shea saw that the twins had something in common with him. At the end of Edgware Road was a shop called Swiss Travel Goods, run by a Polish man named Murray Padro. Shea went there one day in February 1960 and bought an expensive suitcase, promising to return and pay him back later. A few days later, Shea returned with the twins. Under the most flimsy pretext, he blackmailed the shopkeeper, Murray, and demanded a large sum of money after threatening to beat up the shopkeeper. After the twins left, Murray called the police. Both Shea and Reggie were arrested 2 days later when they returned to collect the money. After a trial at the Old Bailey, Shea was sentenced to 3 years in prison for blackmail, and Reggie was sentenced to 18 months. Strangely, Ronnie's name was never mentioned in the case. And so, despite his lack of talent, Ronnie became the sole boss during that time. Then in the fall, he met Peter Rackman. The Golden Age. Hello everyone, let's come to part 3 of the story of the most notorious British bad twins in the 1950s and 1960s, Ronnie and Reggie Kray. Peter Rackman was a notorious landlord in England. He advocated buying up slums in North London, especially around Notting Hill, Rackman also dealt in drugs and was involved in prostitution. He had a large gang of the most powerful thugs to ensure that his business goals were achieved. Ronnie knew Rackman and was excited by the thought of being able to cheat him of his money. So one evening, Ronnie and his friends went to disrupt a party Rackman was hosting in Soho. Rackman agreed to pay protection money to Ronnie to avoid trouble. At first he paid with a check, which was actually defaulted. Then he disappeared. That was the beginning of trouble in Notting Hill. Rackman's debt collectors were badly beaten. Ronnie arrogantly said, "Rackman's guys are good, but my guys are better." The empire he was trying to build was in danger of falling apart. Rackman was a smart guy and understood a guy like Ronnie. He realized that once he paid protection money, there would be no end. What he needed now was a big catch. Illegal gambling had always been the main source of income for organized crime gangs in London. By the mid-1950s, the gambling craze had spread throughout the British capital and become a major industry. The British Parliament almost voted to legalize gambling under the mistaken belief that it would curb crime. Conversely, if gambling were legal, the underworld would be legalized and London would become the Las Vegas of Europe. Rackman connected with his acquaintance Stefan DeFay, who owned the Esmeralda's Barn Casino in Wilton Place, one of London's most prestigious areas. After a meeting involving both brothers, Reggie was now out on bail after a 9-month appeal, and a friend of theirs named Leslie Payne. Stefan agreed to sell his shares for cash but asked the Krays to remain as director and manager of the club. Payne became an important advisor to Ronnie. By the time he met Ronnie, he had bankrupted 14 companies. Payne realized that he could only rely on Ronnie to rebuild his career. He was quite adept at business and had a sense of humor, and was nicknamed Ronnie's Brain. Barn Esmeralda, the first club to open after the Gaming Act came into effect, became a real goldmine for the Kray brothers and Peter Rackman. Payne restructured the club, giving the Krays a 50% stake. They were earning nearly £100,000 a year from dividends. That was a lot of money when the average wage was less than £1,000 at the time. Before Christmas, Reggie's appeal was rejected and he was back in prison for 6 months. Ronnie once again had full ownership of Barn Esmeralda. He enjoyed the joy of being a boss. The manager, in desperation, offered to pay his brothers £1,000 a week to avoid ruining the business, but Ronnie refused. The manager eventually quit and opened his own club. Later, the club became one of the top 4 most famous clubs in London. As for Ronnie, he expanded his relationship with the bosses and important figures in the government. He was even invited to dinner at the House of Lords. Ronnie became a notorious gangster in London. Ronnie came out as gay and began to live as his true self. He paid handsome young men, regardless of nationality or skin color, to sleep with him. He feared the feeling of loneliness every night. But Ronnie gradually lost control of his own real world. Alcoholism combined with the drugs he used such as Stematol made his life worse. As for his brother Reggie, he returned after serving his sentence at Wandsworth Prison. But things were very different now. He was no longer too concerned with business because he was infatuated with a 16-year-old girl with long black hair called Shay and was leading a normal family life rather than a gang life. Her father ran the Regency Club in Stoke Newington, where Reggie met her while he was on parole. They went out a few times, but it was only when he returned to prison that he realized the depth of his feelings. He wrote her love letters every day, and when he was released, he immediately confessed his feelings. Rooney hated women, except his mother and Aunt Rose. So he saw France Shay as a major threat to his relationship with his brother Reggie and made things difficult for them. Reggie was fiercely protective of Shay and determined to marry her. Reggie proposed to Shay in the fall of 1961, but was rejected. Shay felt she was too young to marry. Rejected, Reggie threw himself into work to forget the sadness. By the end of 1962, the Kray gang's revenue had doubled compared to the previous year thanks to Reggie's great contribution. The Kray brothers had in their hands the most famous clubs in London and an endless list of businesses, large and small stores under their protection. When mentioning London, the underworld always mentioned the Kray brothers. Representatives of the American, French, and Corsican mafia gangs operating in London soon contacted the Kray brothers to ensure they had their own scope of operation with the gang's permission. The Kray brothers began to want to dominate the criminal world in the West End, London. They had in their hands a list of high-ranking officials in the police force to facilitate their operations. Ronnie and Reggie became legends in the London underworld. Along with the success of the Kray brothers, Leslie Payne's reputation was also mentioned by many people. Leslie had full authority to make important decisions in the gang and took on the role of main manager. To limit the attention of the authorities, the Kray gang also nominally opened their own businesses, with premises, capital, and bank accounts to start business operations. However, these businesses were quickly closed down, leaving behind bills of debts up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. The manager of these businesses was arrested and sentenced to many years in prison after he accepted all responsibility. In return, an amount of up to £100,000 was deposited by the Kray brothers into his account in Switzerland. Ronnie had a good relationship with Ernest Shinwell, the son of a famous Labour Party politician. Ernest Shinwell supported the gang a lot in business operations and solving problems. Leslie got into serious trouble during a business deal led by Leslie Payne and was arrested in Nigeria. The Kray brothers bailed him out and brought him back to England. The brothers were devastated by this and felt betrayed. Ronnie became angry and violent after the incident. Conflicts often occurred. A very severe punishment proposed by Ronnie to punish those who betrayed and opposed the gang was castration. Many people opposed this decision, including Reggie. By the end of 1963, the debts and liabilities of some clubs were too great, forcing the Kray brothers to close some clubs to focus more on business projects. On July 16, 1964, a British tabloid published a picture of a member of the House of Lords, a leading politician, Lord Boothby, with a notorious gangster Ronnie Kray. There were rumors that they were having an affair. Lord Boothby completely denied the rumor. According to him, there was no relationship between the two. The photo was taken completely by chance. According to Lord Boothby, during an event in Nigeria, Ronnie took the initiative to talk to him and asked to take a photo with him for the purpose of advertising Ronnie's company. On August 7th, the newspaper published an apology and compensated Lord Boothby £40,000. After this incident, the Kray brothers were safe from the press. For the next 3 years, the Kray brothers only appeared in the newspapers talking about their sporting ability and their passion for boxing. The Kray brothers were safe from the media but were under special investigation by the police and representatives of the House of Lords. They wanted to verify the exact relationship between Lord Boothby and the Kray gang. During the investigation, the Kray brothers were found to be involved in another business fraud, and both were arrested. After being granted special bail, the Kray brothers were released after 56 days. Reggie and Frances Shea unexpectedly announced their marriage a few days later. Their wedding was held on April 20th, 1965 at St. James's Church in Bethnal Green. The Shea family was very against this. At the wedding, they wore black to show their attitude to everyone. This made Reggie very angry. Ronnie felt a big change on that special day. Ronnie looked uncertain even as he raised his glass to toast his brother. "I lost half of myself to someone else." After their marriage, Reggie and Ronnie continued to live together in Cedar Court. Shea began to feel that their life together was too suffocating and stressful due to the presence of Ronnie. Her husband spent too much time with his brother and his business. All of Shea's actions were under special supervision of those close to the Kray gang. After only 8 weeks of living together, Shea decided to move back in with her parents. At this time, the Kray brothers were doing big business with the Lucchese crime gang, led by Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo, one of the mafia gangs that dominated New York. The Kray brothers were tasked with ensuring the operations of Lucchese in London. On April 15, 1965, an attack on the Royal Bank of Canada in Montreal was carried out. By early May, a major Ontario bank was also targeted. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in bonds had been stolen. The Krays were given a large share of the proceeds. In July 1965, Payne flew to Montreal and used the bonds to make big deals. The Krays became acquainted with Alan B. Copper, a 36-year-old American businessman. Alan was a mysterious man involved in gold and arms smuggling in the Far East. Alan had very good connections with the American and British security agencies. The The Krays needed Allen to facilitate the sale of the stolen Canadian government bonds. In return, Allen wanted the Krays to protect him in the South London area. They went into business together in late 1965. Through Allen, the Krays began to penetrate the international underworld. The police began to pay more attention to the Kray gang's activities and illegal activities. Over the next few years, the gang operated in a state of unrest. They were not sure how much evidence the police had of their illegal business. Once, to avoid the police's scrutiny, the Kray brothers moved to Morocco for a few weeks. Engrossed in his business dealings, Reggie did not notice that his young wife, Shay, was slowly dying in her marriage. In June 1967, after a long period of treatment in the hospital for a nervous breakdown, Shay committed suicide at home with barbiturates. Ronnie was absent from Shay's funeral. Shay's death pushed Reggie into a bottomless pit of despair and hatred. Reggie turned to alcohol and became more dangerous than ever. Reggie believed that his wife's death was related to other members of the family. Reggie wanted to kill them, but business soon made Reggie forget about this. Continuously involved in big business deals with the world's criminals, one day at the end of May 1968, the Kray brothers were arrested by the police along with 24 other members of the gang. After 8 months of detention, the Kray brothers were brought to trial in early January 1969. This case is considered the most expensive criminal case in British history. Ronnie was sentenced to life in prison and Reggie received 32 years in prison. They were kept in separate prisons. In early 1972, after much effort from the family, Ronnie and Reggie were finally able to meet under the maximum security of the prison. A few years later, Ronnie's mental illness relapsed and was incurable. Ronnie was transferred from prison to Broadmoor Mental Hospital in Berkshire, where he lived the rest of his life. On March 17, 1995, Ronnie Kray died of a heart attack at Wexham Park Hospital in Slough, Berkshire, at the age of 61. Thousands of people lined the streets from Bethnal Green to the cemetery to see Ronnie's coffin. Up to 25 limousines appeared in the funeral procession, which cost up to £10,000. 5 years later, Reggie also passed away. The Kray family buried Reggie next to Ronnie, as Reggie's last wish before he died. "I wanted to be almost half of me." Although they started their careers as amateur boxers from the slums, the Kray brothers quickly became involved in a series of crimes including extortion, armed robbery, arson, hijacking, assault, battery, and murder, and became legends in the London underworld.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. And as always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next one.